Welcome, everybody. My name is Peter Cook. I'm the senior minister here at First Congregational Church, which is a member congregation of the United Church of Christ, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome all of you to this wonderful event this evening. We cannot have an event like this without food, and for any of you who've ever been to the Middle East, any conversation worth its salt begins with a lot of food. So please help yourself and get up as you wish as we go along. And there's lots of wonderful things to eat. So thank you to everybody who brought this food this evening. We are co-sponsoring this event with a lot of people, but I wanted to particularly hold up Vermonters for a Just Peace in Palestine, Israel, and also to thank John Hermans in particular for keeping after me. He's a very persistent fellow, and it's been really a pleasure to work with John to make this all happen, and so thank you, John. So this evening, we are pleased to have several, I guess what we call witnesses, people who have been to Palestine, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, parts of Israel, and really come to us today to testify to what they have seen. And it's often difficult to figure out what's going on over there, looking at, Fox News or whatever it is that you guys watch, and grip really all of what is happening. So it's really immensely helpful to go and actually see for oneself, and not everybody can ever always get to the Middle East, but to really listen to people who have had a first-hand experience with the struggles of Palestinians in that part of the world. So I'm not going to belabor this much more, but I wanted to introduce to you Linda McVeigh, Carol Huntington, Barbara Whitehair, and Carol Kingston, who are all members of the Society of the Campanions of the Holy Cross, which is a religious community of about 800 Anglican women. And it's just terrific to have you here today, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good evening. We're really happy to be here tonight, and I'd just like to thank our host and our many sponsors that made it possible. Before we tell our stories, I would like to share with you some facts from Steadfast Hope that made me make my journey from Boston to Palestine. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was celebrated by people all over the world, everywhere, feeling shared guilt over the atrocities of the Holocaust and the centuries of persecution of the Jewish people. They welcomed a way to fulfill the Jewish dream of a homeland. According to the Jewish narrative, it was billed as a land without people for a people without land. And it was linked to God's promise to Abraham, found in the 12th chapter of Genesis. I was born in the 1940s, and I grew up with the image of Jewish families coming by ship to the Holy Land. It was to me a good and just thing. But that's because nobody ever told me about the Nakba. The Nakba is an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. It refers to the forced expulsion of over 750,000 Palestinians, 75% of the population, from their homes and their land before, during, and after the creation of the State of Israel. Palestine was not a land without people. because Palestine had been populated for thousands of years, and in fact was one of the oldest continuously populated places in the world. When the United Nations adopted a plan to partition Palestine in 1947, 54% of the land went to the Jewish people, even though the Jews only owned 6% of the land at the time. Riots resulted, leading to the destruction of 531 Palestinian villages. 11 urban Palestinian neighborhoods were emptied of their inhabitants and repopulated with Jewish immigrants. In 1949, the Green Line borders were established, giving 50% more land to Israel than was allotted originally by the UN. With this act, 78% of historic Palestine was now part of Israel. And finally, in 1967, Israel preemptively attacked Egypt, Syria, Iraq, the Golan Heights, and the Arab sector of East Jerusalem. 320,000 Palestinians were displaced. For more than half of them, it was the second time. And so began the very complicated history, which has been described as the story of two peoples, three religions, one God, and one land. Since that time, we've had years of incursions and deaths on both sides. The Israelis cry out for security, and many of them want a Jewish-only state. The Palestinians cry out for their own state, the return of their land, and their freedom. We need to pray for both peoples. I wrote to the woman who is organizing our trip, and I said, "It's complicated." She wrote back, and I quote, "We can't let complexity be used as a tool to stop the conversation. The injustice is definable, even in the face of complexity. Naming the injustice is crucial, and that's why we're here tonight." Thank you.
In last November, 5 Campanions joined 18 people from the US, Canada, Sweden on a witness visit sponsored by the Seville Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in East Jerusalem. It is a Palestinian Christian organization founded by Naim Atik, who from 1985 to 97 was the Arabic-speaking pastor of St. George's in Jerusalem, the cathedral church of the Episcopal Diocese that includes Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. We visited refugee camps and saw 200-year-old olive trees that were destroyed and demolished in order to make room for Israeli settlements. We went through checkpoints, met with community-based peacemaking people and programs, and we met with people, peaceful people, from all three faiths. We have heard the testimonies of many people, ranging from medical pioneer Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, also a past candidate for president of the Palestinian Authority, who has been many times and recently in the New York Times. We met with farmers whose homes have been demolished by Israeli authorities, to the family of a mother in Hebron who was currently in prison when we visited them. She simply cried out when her 9-year-old son was beaten by Israeli soldiers in front of their home. We heard more than a dozen formal talks, including one by the American-born Rabbi Arik Asherman, president of Rabbis for Human Rights. He stood in front of bulldozers coming to demolish Palestinian homes, was beaten and imprisoned. He declared that the Israeli government today is the world's worst human rights violator. We visited with scores of ordinary people in homes, tents, and caves, where we were guests for meals with families in their homes. We were rushed out, got out of Tel Aviv within 10 minutes of the airport being closed at 8 a.m. for, quote, military reasons, just 4 days before the military assault on Gaza. We met with many of all three faiths who are working for nonviolent social change and direct action in a peacemaking way. We met many Israeli Jews and American Jews who are committed and working for Palestinian rights. The vast majority of Palestinians, both Christian and Muslim, are hospitable and gracious people who believe fervently in the justice of their cause and who are committed to nonviolent means of achieving justice. I'm going to talk a little bit about refugee camps. There are currently 5 million Palestinian refugees. They're in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. According to the UN Welfare Organization, there are 19 camps in the West Bank, plus another 8 in Gaza. We visited 2. The first was Ada refugee camp in Bethlehem, and then the Shufan refugee camp in East Jerusalem. At Aida, the lights are out at 7 o'clock every night. People live in total darkness with no refrigeration and incursions regularly by the Israeli Defense Force, looking for people. The people say, feel, and certainly look like they are locked and caged in jail. People there hold on to their keys for when they can return to their home. Ada refugee camp on the outskirts of Bethlehem in the West Bank is located on just a quarter of a square mile of land, but it is home to over 4,700 refugees, 60% of whom are under the age of 24. The camp is fully linked to municipal electricity and water grids, but the sewage and water networks are poor. The unemployment rate is 43%. There obviously is severe overcrowding. Shufat refugee camp in East Jerusalem was started in 1967. There's a population now between 11,000 and 18,000, according to UN statistics. they can't determine the exact amount, so they give a range. On 0.2 square kilometers. So imagine 18,000 people in 0.2 square kilometers. The refugee camp is unique in different ways. First, it's the only refugee camp under the complete jurisdiction of the Israeli municipality in Jerusalem. Two, it's the only recognized camp that is comprised fully of 1967 refugees, Jerusalemites who have been evicted since 1967 from the now so-called Jewish quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. According to Israel, the camp is in Israel. According to international law, the camp is in the occupied territories. It has raw sewage in the dirt-rutted streets where we saw hundreds of children playing when they were released from school as we arrived. There are no municipal services. Imagine, no garbage collection. All shelters are connected to the public water and electricity infrastructure, though not all are connected to the public sewer system. Overcrowding is a major problem. We arrived when school got out. The children were both polite and excited. There's a photo that one of our guides showed us of a sign, which is one of the ways that the two peoples are kept apart. People were not allowed to get to know each other. And we'll talk more about that later. Right now, I'm going to try to contrast between the refugee camps and the settlements. We saw scores of settlements at a distance and drove through one settlement. Armed, uniformed guards and armed settlers were all around. There were lush green landscaping, palm trees in the desert land, swimming pools, and even some water parks, versus polluted water and shut off water. Palestinian people use water tanks atop of their buildings. And you can tell who lives in a building because it's the Palestinians who don't have water, who depend upon the rainwater to go into their water tanks, which you will notice some have bullet holes in. There are modern shopping centers versus places, communities with no stores whatsoever. There are beautiful highways versus dirt, rutted, and blocked roads. There is plentiful electricity versus electricity deliberately cut off for long periods in refugee camps and elsewhere where Palestinians live. Our guide Omar from Seville told us that settlements are given biblical names, promoting the idea that they are old when they've only been around since 1967. Some settlers believe they are living in the suburbs. Yet 40% of these huge settlements are empty. We visited Beth Malin Aduan, which is the third largest settlement with 39,000 settlers, which is located on the site of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. We saw there a huge industrial park with 200 businesses, textiles, and manufacturing companies. It has 21 schools, 80 kindergartens, 40 synagogues, and American logos in the modern shopping center. It is the site of 5 or 6 important archaeological sites that non-Jews have no access to. Israeli settlements are illegal according to every basic reading of international law. A settlement is any residential area built across the Green Line, the 1949 ceasefire line between the newly established state of Israel and its Palestinian Arab neighbors. There are currently 121 Israeli settlements and approximately 102 Israeli outposts built illegally on Palestinian land in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The settlements are commonly positioned on hilltops overlooking Palestinian communities. And the settlement wastewater is frequently discharged into nearby villages without treatment. Moreover, solid waste material generated in Israel is dumped without restriction in the occupied territories. Settlements and outposts are inhabited by a population of some 462,000 Israeli settlers. I didn't say that right. The 3 largest settlements have reached city status with over 30,000 residents each. Israeli settlements dominate more than 40% of the West Bank. Israeli West Bank settlers consume an amazing 200 liters of water per day per person, compared to 86 liters per day available for Palestinians in the West Bank, only 60 of which are considered potable. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, Linda and I listened to a woman, the Palestinian woman who's in charge of the water in Palestine for both the West Bank and Gaza. That's her job. She came and talked to us, and one of the things that she said, which I didn't know until then, was that in some communities, there is water for Palestinians of only 20 liters per person per day. The World Health Organization recommends a minimum of 100 liters per day. I've tried to demonstrate the stark contrast between the displaced Palestinians living under what most would consider apartheid conditions and the comfortable, enriched, entitled surroundings of the settlers. Many of the settlers have no clue of what I have described to you. They just think they are living in the suburbs, and so they are. But we must not, and we will not forget. We will all be witnesses. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carol Kingston, and I'm going to be talking to you about the separation of Israelis and Palestinians in Palestine, Israel. It's state of Israel is intent on reducing interaction between Jews and Arabs. Jews are not allowed to travel into the West Bank or Gaza. There was a slide earlier that said that Israelis were prohibited from going into the West Bank because it was dangerous to their lives and it was illegal. Arab movement is restricted in Israel as well as in the West Bank and Gaza. There are several methods of separation. The first method is a wall, and there's a picture of a wall in a city. We think it's Bethlehem. On the left over there is a turret, which is where the Israeli Defense Force watches what goes on. And these cars are just parked up against it. It was built in earnest after Palestinian violence in 2002. And the pros for raising it was that it would prevent terrorists and suicide bombers from invading Israel. And it has reduced that violence since it's been raised. However, there are cons to this wall as well. It places Palestinian territory on the Israeli side of the wall, because if you have a border, the wall is built into Palestine to assure that all of Israel's territory is on the Israeli side of the wall. This inhibits movements of Palestinians within the West Bank. It limits access to work in Israel. And the UN International Court of Justice declared the wall illegal in 2004. When it is finished, it will be 430 miles of barrier. In rural areas, it will be an electric fence with deep ditches on either side. In more densely populated areas, it is a solid concrete wall, 26 feet high. The effect of this wall is that it separates farmland owned by Palestinians from where they live, from their houses. Mohammed Jalbel lives 10 minutes from his fields. Then the wall was built between his house and his fields. Unfortunately, the gate that would give him access to his fields was not open to Arabs. After several attempts, he finally got a permit to use another gate. At this gate, it took him an hour to get to his fields, and he often had to wait hours for the gate to open. It separates neighborhoods from commercial areas. Claire Anastas has a gift shop in Bethlehem. It was in the middle of a commercial business area. There is an Israeli military base almost next door. Before the wall was built, the IDF harassed her and her family at night, they would train their laser gun sights on her children's faces, which was terrifying, of course, to all of them. But she did not leave. And so they built the wall. When they built the wall, they surrounded her so no one would know if she had a shop unless she guided them there. And you see the little boxy thing with a building in the middle of it. That is Claire's shop. And what they wanted was, the Israelis wanted access to Rachel's tomb and, of course, to their military base. And had Claire left, that might have been fairly easy. It would not have been the Byzantine wall that was built. But that's what they felt they had to do. And so now Claire's business is such that nobody knows it exists unless somebody leads people there to see it. There's restricted movement all over the West Bank. There are over 600 checkpoints, roadblocks, and segregated roads in the West Bank. And we can go to the next slide if you would. This is our tour group going into a checkpoint to observe. At permanent gates in the wall, they are guarded by military or police. You must have a permit to pass. They're only open at certain hours. Sometimes it's easy to get through, and sometimes it's not easy to get through. The rules do change from time to time. There are people going through a checkpoint. Last year, Suhail Dawani, the Episcopal Bishop of Jerusalem, had his permit to enter East Jerusalem, where his cathedral was, canceled. He lives in Ramallah. It took intervention by, who was it that intervened? It was by the chief rabbi in Jerusalem before he got his ability to go to work restored to him. Jean Zaru, a Quaker living in Ramallah, was unable to get a permit to visit her dying aunt in a hospital in Jerusalem. More than one newborn has been lost because the checkpoint was closed when the mother needed to get to the hospital. And we can go to, I think, the next slide. There are also flying checkpoints. These are temporary random checkpoints set up within the West Bank to check documentation of Palestinians, often significantly delaying their trips. Here's another checkpoint in Hebron. There are also roadblocks, concrete blocks placed by military in Palestinian roads to inhibit traffic and delivery of goods, forcing drivers to transfer cargo from one truck on one side of the block to a truck on the other. This slows commerce and makes it certainly more expensive. There are segregated roads. There are bypass roads that connect settlements directly with Jerusalem and other parts of Israel. Carol referred to that when she said that many settlers think they live in the suburbs because that's really all they see. The bypass roads are exclusively for Israelis, for settlement people, and Palestinians are not allowed to drive on them unless they have a special permit. And in order to enforce this, Palestinian license plates are green and Israeli license plates are yellow. Here we are in Hebron, where there is a main pedestrian road with Jersey barriers delineating where the Palestinians are allowed to walk. Whereas on this side, other people can walk. We walked on this side here. There are other ways of shielding Israelis from Palestinians. In the next slide, you'll show a barrier so that the Palestinian village on the other side of that wall can't be seen by people who travel by it. By keeping Jews and Arabs separated, the state of Israel prevents the human interaction that allows them to realize that we are all one human family. Most Jewish and Arab youth have never seen each other, let alone interacted. It allows demonization on both sides, and it's intolerable.
Everywhere we went in Palestine, people begged us to tell their stories. I have 2 stories to tell you about house demolition sites. The first is in a house called Arabia, located in the west bank of the town of Anata, just northeast of Jerusalem. Imagine it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and suddenly you are awakened by soldiers with weapons who tell you that the government has arbitrarily decided that the home where you live and where your ancestors have lived for hundreds of years is located on land that is now deemed agricultural. You must demolish your house by yourself within 24 hours or pay the Israeli government to demolish it for you. The next night, you and your 6 sleeping children are again awakened and told that you have 15 minutes to get your belongings and clothes out of your home. You can't possibly grab your 6 sleeping kids and anything significant in that amount of time. Next come the canisters of gas because you took too long. This is a reality for Palestinians who have had the misfortune to live on land that the Israelis want for new settlements. Their property rights are usurped daily through the denial of permits, followed by the issuance and execution of demolition orders. This happened to Salim and his wife. Their house was rebuilt for the 5th time in 2012 by the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. 30 internationals stood side by side with Israelis and Palestinians who refused to be enemies, demonstrating that there are partners for peace. Within 2 weeks, and with the help of almost 100 additional volunteers, the pile of rubble that was left after the 5th demolition was transformed into a beautiful home with a terrace and a garden for the family, as well as a peace center dedicated in the memory of Rachel Corey and Nuha Swiden, an American and a Palestinian who died resisting house demolitions in Gaza. The beautiful rebuilt Beit Arabia was on our itinerary for a visit in November. 3 days before we arrived, it was demolished for the 6th time. All we saw was an ugly pile of rubble where the new house had once stood. Salim and his wife and children were living nearby in a relative's house. They greeted us warmly. They are living symbols of resistance to the occupation. They stand steadfastly for justice and peace. They are determined that they will not be moved off their land. They are determined to rebuild again. They are determined to be nonviolent witnesses. Every year, hundreds of Palestinians are forced from their homes built on land that they own. Since 1967, the Israelis have demolished more than 26,000 Palestinian homes in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, so that Jewish settlements and the wall can be built. Today, a vote is before the Knesset to endorse the Power Plan, a plan to forcibly remove 70,000 Bedouin Arabs from land that they have owned before the state of Israel was created. In fact, they've lived there for 7 centuries. There are Israelis who are appalled by what is happening to the Palestinians, but the majority is for a Jewish expansion until all of the occupied territories become part of a Jewish-only state. We call this ethnic cleansing. Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who lived under the South African apartheid rule, has identified the Israeli government as an apartheid regime. So did President Jimmy Carter as early as 1972. And Nelson Mandela has recently stated that he will not be free until the Palestinian people are free. The Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions has stated that the policies and practices of the Israelis may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the Palestinians are standing steadfastly. They, for the most part, are gentle, welcoming, loving people. All that they ask is that we hold them in our prayers and we tell people back home their stories. Please pray for Salim and his family. The second story is about a Bedouin camp, Palestinian Susia, located at the bottom of the West Bank, south of Hebron. It has been razed 5 times. Since it's classified within Area C of the West Bank, it lies under Israeli military control. Although they own much of the land, Susia's 350 residents are denied permits to build houses, schools, or clinics, and they dwell mostly in a collection of shabby tents. Last June, an Israeli court issued 6 demolition orders covering most of the structures in Susia. The order was issued even though the rights over the land of the residents had been demonstrated and acknowledged by Israeli authorities. Over 500 people from Tel Aviv, Beersheba, and Jerusalem came to Susia to mount a peaceful protest. A villager from Susia told 15 visiting European diplomats, and I quote, "There are in this village octogenarians who are older than the state of Israel. How can they be told that their residence here is illegal?" While we visited Susia, Israeli military helicopters circled overhead, watching everything that we did. It was the only time during my trip that I was fearful. The only reason that Susia exists today is that it's protected by internationals and rabbis for human rights, who have to stay on the land 24/7 to ensure that the demolition doesn't take place. On January 31st of this year, the Supreme Court in Israel heard 2 petitions. One was for the immediate demolition of the village. The other, introduced by Rabbis for Human Rights, was for the protection of the villagers and their land. Rabbi Arik Asherman asked the court, and thereby the people of Israel, and I quote, "How can we be a country that twice expelled families from Susia, pressed them until they lived in caves, destroyed those caves, and then issued demolition orders for anything they built with a roof? If we recognize who we are today, we will succeed in becoming the people we want to be tomorrow." Susia is a village that will not give up. They will stay steadfast. Please pray for the people of Susia. Please also pray for the Israel Jewish groups whose awareness has been raised and who work tirelessly in their effort to ensure and restore Palestinian rights, including Rabbis for Human Rights and the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. In this country, the Jewish Voice for Peace and J Street are also trying to raise awareness. I have shared the story of 2 ongoing demolition sites. That's what I promised to do. Over the 2 weeks of our trip, we heard many stories, but these were the first that made me cry. When we visited the Anglican Church in Zababde, Father Nael told us to deliver this message to you and to anyone who wants to visit the Holy Land. And I quote, "They call us the forgotten people. You are here today, so we are not forgotten. We are the living stones. It's important to be connected to you and be brothers and sisters in faith. If you come to the land of the Holy One and see people keeping the faith, it should encourage and strengthen your faith. It has strengthened my faith. I am forever changed. Thank you.
One of our members, as you probably can see, is missing tonight. So I'm going to start. My name is Barbara Whitehair, and I'm going to start with Betty Lane's presentation. And this is about economic development in Palestine and about Kairos, Palestine. Despite what we have said so far, the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Israel are by far and large, a happy people. They are hopeful, they have faith in God, and they don't want to be enemies with their Jewish neighbors. We visited many non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, in Palestine, Palestinian-controlled areas. These provide a number of services. First of all, education for children and youth, enrichment through media and computer training, and teaching about human rights to build self-esteem. The Palestinian people are determined to stay on their own land and return, if possible, to the land they own and were forced off of. These NGOs also provide clean and safe places to play. This is a playground that they have constructed just in the lee of an area of the wall. They also provide hospitality to visitors, and they provided us with a traditional Palestinian dish here of chicken and rice, which the women all cooked in these huge kettles, and the men came out and turned them over for us. And then as we went to our individual tables, there were all little plates of chopped cucumbers and onions, and tomatoes and hummus. There are a number of women's co-ops also, which provide some economic support because outside jobs are scarce, both for men and for women. This is another one of the NGOs that you're seeing here. NGOs, in addition to everything else that they do, teach hope and nonviolence. The Kairos Palestinian document is evidence of this commitment to hope and nonviolence. And I'm just going to let you take a minute to read the screen here. There are few jobs in the Palestinian area. The service work, including room cleaning at our hotels, was done by young people, primarily young, probably unmarried men. Some of the desk clerks were women, but the rest of the workers were men. This young man called us aside in our travels. He had been jailed. He had not done anything wrong, but he had been jailed. And because of that, he lost his job in Jerusalem. And so what he does now is he gets up at 3 a.m. and he has one of those little carts. He sells coffee and tea and snacks to other Palestinians going into Jerusalem to work. Economic activity goes on in streets of cities and villages, as you see here in this farmer state market. There are independent small industrial crafts that we saw in Jerusalem there, and here at a pottery, small pottery factory in Hebron where we visited. NGOs and other organizations help women's co-ops to provide some economic support because jobs are scarce for both men and women. This is one such women's co-op. Again, the man is the one who's out front, you notice. This is in a cave in Susia. And then there are also in markets at Canaan, where homemade goods are sold. And they call it Canaan, not Canaan. And as a result of the Palestinian initiative, you see another example with the Palestinian Fair Trade Association, which we visited. And they have a small olive factory there where they process their own olives into tapenade and various products for sale, and olive oil, and they have almonds as well. They distribute these products through the Palestine Fair Trade Association online, and some churches are taking this on as a project to order some of these products and then make them available to their church members to sell, and so help support their small industry in that way. These products can also be purchased in natural food stores in the United States. We all want peace in Jerusalem, and we, of course, are told in the Psalms to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and in all of the Holy Land. We visited the Quaker Friends Meeting House in Ramallah, which is working mightily for peace and development throughout that area. We heard Jean Zaru, who is the president of the meeting house, and other speakers. This is a U.S.-born businessman who was trying to help them develop their internet capacity and sharing the obstacles put in his way by the Israeli authorities. Most people go about their daily lives just trying to survive and have a somewhat normal life. And this is a street scene in Ramallah where we visited, and we had lunch in a falafel shop, and then went for ice cream across the street. It was delicious. On Sunday, we attended the nearby church, which Linda was sharing with you about. The priest there has worked to make the church a center for education and enrichment for the community. They have a women's co-op there as well. And that's me trying to support the cause. And he's developed a library. Very friendly, welcoming guy, as you can see there. He also has developed a medical clinic and a computer center. Much of our trip was one of seeing people work for their future and for peace. We came home inspired by the joy and hope and hospitality of the Palestinian people in spite of their daily struggles to survive and thrive. We urge you to do all you can do to support their cause. Thank you. My talk is entitled 3 Gifts. I was the only one of our group who did not bring a camera to Palestine, so I have to start my talk with true confessions and with thanks to my fellow witnesses for sharing their pictures with me. I also would like to start with a disclaimer. Many Jews, both inside and outside of Israel, tend to interpret any support for Palestinians as anti-Semitic. I've heard it, I'm sure you have as well. It is important to state that in our presentations, we are speaking about what we have seen and heard in less than 2 weeks of travel in Israel, Palestine, mostly of it in the West Bank. The situation there today is extremely complex, and we do not attempt to address it in its broadest dimensions. We ourselves went in order to find out more about what life for the Palestinians is like under Israeli occupation, because these facts are not well represented in the Western media. We are not anti-Semitic, and the Palestinians that we met with did not speak against Jews. Rather, we, like they, pray and work to change the structures of oppression, which hurt both Palestinians and Jews. A Palestinian saying on the separation wall says it well: one wall, two prisons. One wall, two prisons. And that doesn't say that there, but we saw it. We long to see both peoples free and prosperous. In the face of the horrors of the Holocaust, most people of goodwill have rejoiced to see Israel have a land of their own. But when you look at this map, these maps, and you have a card of that on your seats, and see that all of that green in 1946 was Palestine, was Palestinian land. And now those few little dots represents what's left of it. You begin to see what injustice has been perpetuated against the Palestinians since that initial land grant. And I told it since 2010, and we continue to hear of new settlements being built in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. So that is even worse than what that looks like there. Apartheid, when I looked up in my dictionary at home, the definition was written, of course, during the time of the South African apartheid. It's described as an official policy of racial segregation promulgated with a view to promoting and maintaining white ascendancy, and that's what it was in South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who lived under that regime, has identified the Israeli government as an apartheid regime. So has President Jimmy Carter. So has Episcopal Bishop Tom Shaw of Massachusetts. On this trip, we had the opportunity to observe in tragic detail the reality of this description. The separation wall and checkpoints are just the tip of the iceberg. As you have heard, there are two separate highway systems with different colored license plates for Jews and Palestinians to make sure that neither can go on each other's roads. The highways on which the settlers travel put our highways in Massachusetts to shame. I used to call it the Israeli Turnpike. They are amazing. The Palestinian roads are poorly kept up. Wherever the two road systems intersect, the settlers always have the right of way. If there was a light, it stays green longer for the settlers than for the Palestinians. The separation wall zigzags in and out of the legally established green line, and we've shown you that in the example here of Claire Nasco's house and shop, maximizing the land which the Jews own and taking land from the Palestinians, often constructed to separate Palestinians from their livelihood, their olive groves, and their shops. We saw the most glaring example of this at Claire's house. She told us that her children went to school one morning, and when they came home in the afternoon, there was the wall right in front of the house. And it would have been even closer, but there was a sewer line that ran right there, so they had to put it a little further away. Government rules change constantly so that the Palestinians are always kept off balance. The army arrests people with impunity, like a 9-year-old boy whom they told, "We are arresting you for throwing rocks." "We don't think you did, but you might have." And then when her mother protested, they arrested her too. She had been in prison for 3 days at the time the family told us this story. we learned that at least half of the male Palestinian population has been in Israeli jails. Palestinians cannot live in, work in, or visit Jerusalem without a government permit, which can be withdrawn at any time. And we were so, just so stunned when Jean Zaro shared that story with us about her 93-year-old aunt dying in Jerusalem. And this woman who travels the world to speak and work for peace was refused the right to visit her dying aunt. Palestinians living in the West Bank cannot visit Gaza or vice versa without a permit. All Palestinians have to carry an identity card which tells where they live. Time does not permit me. There is not time to tell you all the ways that apartheid is enforced. Underlying and supporting all these policies is the Zionist philosophy, a land with no people, for a people with no land. This saying reminds me very much of the Manifest Destiny policy that an attitude that existed in our own country towards the native peoples of our land. And many of the same kinds of policies have been used in both instances. The Zionist thesis is that the land of Israel is meant to be the homeland for the Jews and the Jews alone. Therefore, its policies, both official and unofficial, are designed to maximize the land owned by Jews and to force the Palestinians to leave. Sadly, this policy is enforced in many instances using tactics that the Third Reich inflicted on the parents and grandparents of the present residents. So instead of a swastika on houses and shops that have been boarded up, you see the Star of David. Instead of crystal knock, we saw shops and homes that had to have grills on their windows because the settlers would throw rocks to break the windows. There are many gifts that I brought back with me from our time with Palestinian peace activists, and I'd like to share 3 of these. I fell in love with the Palestinian people. This was my first exposure. They were so hospitable and so welcoming everywhere we went. Big smiles. Welcome to Palestine. In the refugee camp, the little boys would come by, big grin. Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? And everywhere we went, we were greeted very warmly. The scarf I'm wearing was given to me by a teenage boy at the Palestinian Fair Trade Center when we visited. He was wearing it, and I went up and I said, "Oh, that's beautiful." And he just went like this. So I reached over and gave him a little kiss. Probably embarrassed at the tears, but it was so sweet. I spent half a trip, I think, at Angel's Souvenir Store, at least half a time in Bethlehem. This is right around the corner from our hotel, and they had just wonderful gifts. But when I first went into the shop, the shopkeeper, the first thing he said to me was, "Would you like tea or coffee?" And I was like, "Huh?" And he must have seen my face, and he said, "Oh, this is just typical Palestinian hospitality." And it was that way everywhere we went. This scene was repeated over and over again, often with food as well, everywhere we went, even in refugee camps, even in the tent of a family whose home had just been demolished, and finally at a coffee hour at the church that we went to on Sunday. The second gift I brought back was the privilege to witness the Palestinian commitment to active, nonviolent resistance. Don't you love that? Make homos, not war. Having observed the oppression of the Palestinian people firsthand, it is surprising to me on some level that there are not more terrorists. I learned, however, that the first Intifada, or uprising, was largely nonviolent. I learned that the Palestinians had been taught that their plight was God's will. The Bible had been used in that way. Again, just like with blacks in this country, right? Your position in society is God's will. Naim Atik, the founder of Sabil, which sponsored our trip, he's an Episcopal priest, lecturer, author, has revolutionized the lives of many Palestinians by introducing them to liberation theology. He taught them that they are God's beloved children and that God's will for them is freedom, not oppression. And he taught them that the way to work for that freedom is through active, nonviolent resistance. When we visited with Jean Zaru, she spoke powerfully to this point. She said, if we believe in equality, we must resist. There are other responses to oppression, she said. One can withdraw, one can accommodate, one can manipulate. But none of these responses is transformative. Active, nonviolent resistance is transformative. We must work for peace, she said, or pay for war. We saw this commitment to active nonviolent resistance everywhere we went. We saw it in the pictures and sayings written on the wall. We saw it in the rebuilding of homes that had been demolished. We saw it in the opening of the Palestinian homes and lives to international visitors. We saw it in a saying posted at the entrance to the Tent of Nations, an educational and ecological farm in Bethlehem. The saying is, we refuse to be enemies. The third gift I brought back was the Palestinian care for the land. This was brought home to me most powerfully when we visited the Tent of Nations, where the NASA extended family has lived since 1916. They have worked the land by day and slept in caves overnight, so as not to disturb the land. Historically, Palestinians have been mostly farmers and herders. The olive tree is their national symbol and the source of many livelihoods. Like the olive tree itself, their roots go deep into the land, and their lives have evolved in harmony with it through the careful stewardship of its resources. This is the Garden of Gethsemane, with a couple of olive trees there that we saw that probably go back to the time of Christ. I'd like to end my presentation with a prayer. Lord, hear us as we remember those affected by the settlements and land confiscations in Palestine. We pray for Palestinian families forced to leave their homes. We pray for Jewish settlers that you will open their eyes to a different vision that will allow them to live in peace with their neighbors. We ask you to strengthen the hands of Palestinians and Israelis who work for an end to oppression and injustice. Finally, we pray for the people of Palestine and Israel and for ourselves, that you will show us the way to be instruments of your just peace in your world. Thank you for inviting us here today to share with you.
Very emotional. It was very hard. People ask us, what can I do? It starts with prayer. I urge you to pray because God listens. He hears us. Educate yourselves by going to websites like Jewish Voice for Peace and Rabbis for Human Rights. And speak out against the injustices. I urge you to tell one other person about the Nakba and ask that person to tell one other person. It has been kept a secret too long. Write to your congressmen and women, urging them to consider Israel's human rights abuses when they so freely give money to Israel. Join the BDS movement. Boycott, divest, and sanction. I brought with me tonight, and they were placed on your seats, cards that you can take with you when you shop so that you can easily identify products made by companies who profit from the occupation, like SodaStream, Sabra Hummus, Ben and Jerry's, and Motorola. Also, there is a group of committed people in Vermont who have been working hard since 2001 on this issue. The group is Vermonters for a Just Peace in Palestine, Israel. They meet on the second Monday of every month at the Peace and Justice Center in Vermont at 6:00 p.m., and all are welcome. On the display table, there's a sign-up sheet if you would like if you see resources that we can email to you. And finally, as Jesus commanded us, love. On the Palestinian side of the wall is written, love wins. Love everyone, everywhere, until the words, the other, cease to exist. Thank you.